Good morning and welcome to Morning Scoop for Friday, February 25th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The spring game is in 50 days, the Notre Dame game in 190 days, the game against Michigan in 274 days. Last June, more or less out of nowhere, it came out that the folks in charge of the college football playoff were talking about expanding from 4 to 8 or even 12 teams, and it could happen as soon as 2023. This set off a bunch of big and heated debates and gave those wonderful folks who host daily college football podcasts lots to talk about. And then last week, it came out that the deal was dead, the playoff was staying at 4 throughout the end of the current deal, and no expanded playoff until at least the 2026 season. So what does that mean for Ohio State and the Big Ten, and is it a good thing or not? My guest today is Marcus Hartman of the Dayton Daily News. Marcus, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this came as a little bit of a surprise to me, this decision, because, it sounded, the way they floated it last summer, generally they don't float stuff like that unless it's pretty close to done. And the last several decades of college football history have all pointed to the exact same process for how these decisions get made, which is, how can we make the most money the soonest? So this seemed very much like, well, this is obviously what's going to happen. And, the expanded playoff would have meant more money, and they would have had the new TV deal sooner. And, that is typically how all this stuff gets done. So why did that not happen in this case?
Well, I think maybe the simplest answer is that's just how bad a plan it is. All the columns that were immediately written about it were, oh, this is just such a failure of leadership and blah, 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 which is true to a certain extent, but only because they failed to understand what a crappy plan it is, and therefore how hard it would be to actually push through even if you were already at the 2-yard line. The most obvious explanation is the one people are ignoring, and that it's just a bad plan. Because it's a bad plan for multiple reasons. One, it just logistically has major issues. And beyond that, it's unnecessary. Everybody, like you said, it kind of caught everybody by surprise, and a lot of people were like, oh, wow, this is actually creative and interesting and surprising, which it is creative, I will give them that. But it's also kind of against the ethos of everything that college football had been leading up to this point, which isn't necessarily a deal breaker. Sometimes it's good to change. But I think it's remarkable that all the arguments that we ever had about whether or not there should ever be a playoff, the biggest ones were like, is it too many games? What does it do to the regular season? 100% have been ignored by all the people actually debating whether or not there should be an expansion of the playoff. And to that extent, there's really been no debate. It's just been the people at the top saying, obviously this is good and it should happen. And then probably half the fans saying, yes, I agree, this is good. And then maybe there have been then some more of the people on the lower levels saying, I don't know about this. But it was still, like you said, kind of a foregone conclusion of what's going to happen because A, the money, especially now more than ever, they're desperate for money. And B, a lot of times it's prudent to not put something forward like this unless you actually have, you have the support to get it passed. And so maybe that the latter thing, it was a very small group. It was only 4 people working on it, and they mostly didn't talk to anybody else about it. So, which is how it became such a surprise. So maybe that's part of the reason. They really were in their little bubble while they were developing it. So it just didn't dawn on them some of the things that wouldn't work. And then the alternative to that too, the what goes along with that, I should say, is that new people in the room with new commissioners at 3 of the conferences. Those are obviously they misread. 2 of those people are complete outsiders, so obviously they completely misread their reaction. And Jim Phillips is the first time at the ACC. He has been in college football at least, so he understands those things. But this is the first time he's been in charge of a conference. So, and he's the guy bringing up actual concerns from coaches and players. So, it's not hard to see how it failed if you're not just biased toward the actual plan, which most of the people writing about it are. So that's one of the other things that's been sort of an odd. That's added to the oddity of the whole thing.
Yeah, and the vote was 8-3. It had to be unanimous because this was going to supersede the last couple of years of the existing TV deal. So they needed it to be unanimous in this case. It was not. The ACC, Pac-12, and Big Ten all objected. Those were the 3 conference commissioners you mentioned who are relatively new: Kevin Warren and George Kliavkoff and Jim Phillips. The ACC's objection, as you mentioned, is kind of player and health and safety concerns with playing more games, and can you do it safely, and is this going to be too much wear and tear on their bodies? The Pac-12, a lot of their concerns centered around the Rose Bowl, and is that going to retain its exclusive slot for New Year's Day? The Big Ten wanted 6 auto bids, which I'm not sure that's why that was the hill that the Big Ten wanted to die on, but Also, probably wanted to get their TV deal done, and then by not signing the deal right now, they're still ESPN is still in an exclusive negotiating window right now. So by not signing a deal right now, not extending right now, you're by the time you get to 2026, you can open it up to all the other networks. So Fox and CBS and NBC and Apple and Hulu and whoever else you want to speculate on, all those entities can bid on this. Google. And the Big Ten is going to probably have a TV deal with some of those entities in place before then. So the Big Ten obviously probably not thrilled about the idea of giving ESPN just carte blanche over this whole thing for the foreseeable future. So, all of those are, I think, viable concerns. I guess the question is, how many of those are still going to be concerns in 2026? Like what among those is still going to hang this thing up whenever they get back in a room in a few years and start talking about it again?
Well, I mean, the auto bid thing is almost the same thing, which is why it's kind of ridiculous to even bother bringing that up. So like in the Rose Bowl, I'm not really sure how to solve the Rose Bowl problem. I mean, I feel like a lot of things people are arguing for the Rose Bowl, it's dead, like it's over. And people even say, well, the Rose Bowl got great ratings this year. Well, Ohio State was in it; it was competitive, and that's really more just how bad all the other games are. Like the Rose Bowl is just the least diminished of all the non-playoff bowls, and it is a great site and it is cool. But the players, I mean, they did a good job of pretending like it makes a difference to them if they're in them. Obviously, it makes a difference if they're in a major bowl versus a not major bowl. But I mean, it's not really that big of a deal. So I'm not exactly sure what the answer is with the Rose Bowl. I mean, the best answer for the Rose Bowl is probably that it is just always a semifinal on January after any its time, and it's just the Big Ten Pac-12 thing. That, if anything gives, that may be the most realistic thing. Because obviously, again, that's really happened 20 years ago, too. It's not like that would be they'd all of a sudden be ripping that Band-Aid off. It's already happened multiple times. And I'm sure that it's not ideal, but there's no perfect scenario for that. If the Rose Bowl wants to be involved, and you've got to think at the end of the day, being involved in some way is better than not being involved. So I think that's the best explanation, the best thing for the Rose Bowl. The player safety stuff, I mean, that stuff can all get worked out too, because there are solutions. I just think it's going to take time to get to them. And that's stretch out the length of time the games are played, preferably eliminate a regular season game or the conference championship games, or do both. And if you want to stay at a 12-team playoff, or do what actually makes sense and just do an 8-team playoff. So there certainly can expand. The options are there. And as I said, as the first second I ever heard of the 4-team playoff, it's silly that the semifinals for the 4-team playoff are January 1st. Like, that should be when the championship game is. I think that's common sense to everybody. But the fact that they did it that way made it very easy to add one more week in the middle of December. And if you change the rest of the schedule and move it up a week, which would actually make things fairly traditional for November, it would make November of, now match November of like the first 100 years. It's only been 20 years or so or less since, Ohio State and Michigan didn't play until after Thanksgiving until like 2008 or 9 or whenever. So you could move up the whole schedule and that gives you another week. But the problem is, again, I think this 12 team is just like the worst possible solution, no matter what changes you're willing to make. To me, your playoff should either be 8 and you make the regular season better, which makes the regular season better, or you forget all the bowls. You probably still have to go to an 11-game regular season, and you go to a real playoff, like 16, 20, 24, name the number of teams. Have a real playoff that starts on Thanksgiving or whenever. That would just be a matter of sitting down and hammering it out. This 12-team playoff tacked on to a 12-game regular season with conference championship games does not work. It just won't. It will not work, and they can't do it. So, did they assume that they would change the regular season when they came up with this plan? I doubt it, because they obviously don't have that much foresight. Did they assume teams would get rid of their conference championship games? Maybe they thought it was possible, because Gene Smith last week, actually floated the idea that they'd at least consider getting rid of their conference championship games. So maybe those other these guys that came up with the 12-team playoff thought that was in the realm of possibility, but I doubt it. I'm not going to give them the credit for that kind of foresight. I think they just literally said, well, this is cool. It's built with it allows more teams to be involved. There's more games. We'll make a lot of money. Obviously, people will just love it, and they're gonna worship us for coming up with this awesome plan. Because again, if they had thought at all ahead, they should have realized there's absolutely no way that they're going to play all through January and really no breaks in December, and only like 1 week or 2 weeks off that in December anyway. Too, it's absolutely and completely ridiculous plan that it's insane to think they ever thought would actually work, because it doesn't at all.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're still pretending to care about academics, so you're running games through finals of the first fall semester, and you're running, you're going to be on the road for weeks.
We heard forever you can't have second semester football, which is why it was ridiculous to me that they had the championship game, that when they did the playoff, they moved it. That put them firmly into literally in the second semester, not like one day before the second semester, literally in the second semester. And so, and of course, everyone just blew over that. Hey, but it's 2 teams and it's 1 week, whatever. But now you're going to play like a whole playoff in January? Give me a break. Like, first of all, did you just forget about that? Were you just lying before about all of it? I mean, obviously that's possible, about caring about second semester football. But I find it insane that all these concerns are just, they're not even mentioned. It's not like they're mentioned and then you're told why they don't exist anymore. It's just like it never happened. Like the whole thing is like a big gaslighting adventure for people who actually paid attention in the 90s.
Before we hit record on this, I think basically had the whole conversation we're about to have again. But we talked for 20 minutes about some of this stuff before we started recording. And one of the things you were talking about was we just on the show talked about, here's some of the objections of the 3 conferences that voted against it. The SEC, the Big 12, and the AAC, the American, were all pretty strongly in favor of the existing plan. So, what about the existing plan and the fact that it is 12 teams? What about that would be so appealing to the 3 conferences I just mentioned?
Well, I think, again, I think the reason that they ended up on this bad plan is they were coming at it from the wrong angle. The angle shouldn't be including as many teams as possible. Again, that's completely counter to how we've ever done anything in the past. And if you want it to be like that, fine, but don't expect to have people just assume that that's a good idea. And so, obviously, including as many teams as possible is what the Big 12 and the Group of 5 conferences, which the Big 12 basically is a Group of 5 conference now after they lose Oklahoma and Texas. Obviously, the more spots there are, the better, because that makes it, instead in 8, maybe you guarantee 1 spot for those teams, and you guarantee 1 spot for the Power 5 conferences, such as they are. But that's going to be all you get. And you still may not, who knows, maybe if they didn't do an automatic qualifier for the Group of 5 schools, which I would not support in an 8-team playoff, because it would basically just be locking in a sacrificial lamb as the 8 seed every year who would get blown out every year. It'd be a complete farce. I would not do that, but it makes sense that these smaller leagues, obviously they want more slots. That's good for them. But then the thing that has not been talked about at all, Greg Sankey is in the catbird seat here because they can get the majority of teams in the 4-team playoff. They can get a majority of teams in the 8-team playoff. But it's actually, in going to 12 is probably a bigger benefit to them than it is the other Power 5 schools. Because, okay, well, they'd like to have 2 teams out of 4, 3 teams out of 8. That's nice. Well, they could get like 5 or 6 teams in a 12-team playoff, depending on the year. Especially if teams are really down and some of the other leagues are down. That's, incrementally better. That's more than incrementally better. That's exponentially better. So I think that's the hidden genius of it from the SEC standpoint, is they're saying that it'll be half an SEC invitational the way it is. Because look how often, when you get down to ranking teams like 8 through 15, how many people go, well, it's an SEC team versus whoever. I mean, how many other times is team number 12 or 13 a team that you're like, well, they're okay, but they're an SEC team, so I guess we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. So I'm sure he's thinking they can pigeonhole more than just a 3rd team, more like a 4th or a 5th team in there if there's a 12-team playoff. And that's, again, another thing that hasn't really been discussed. So it's a greater benefit to the SEC than it would be to the other power leagues, and even the Big Ten. I don't know if the Big Ten is ever going to actually approach getting that many teams in. Now, they have a better chance of getting, 2 or 3 teams in the Big Ten would basically always get 2 teams, I would imagine, in a 12-team playoff. They have a better chance of getting those extra teams in than the ACC and the Pac-12 and the Big 12, but it's still not as much as the SEC. So I think that's kind of an angle that hasn't been explored.
Reading the reactions to this over the last few days, you talk. I mean, there are certain people that you kind of you automatically just see the byline and you kind of roll your eyes and you move on. Someone who's not like that to me is Dan Wetzel from Yahoo. He's usually someone who's pretty plugged in, who I find myself agreeing with more often than not. But I'm not sure I really agree with his thought on this one. His idea was that the Alliance Leagues really blew their leverage by not coming to a deal right now. And the idea being that it took all of the conferences coming to a unanimous decision now to end the current deal early, as I said earlier. But now, by waiting until the deal's done, now they only need a majority. So the vote was 8-3 this time. So now the Alliance Leagues, the Big Ten, Pac-12, ACC, can't hold the decision up. They can't hold it hostage, if you want to frame it that way. But that was his thinking. I'm not sure I agree with that necessarily, but I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see that either. And it's the same thing, Andy Staples is another national guy that I always typically am in line with on a lot of points of view. And he thought that it was weird that the other 3 power leagues were especially the Big Ten, were kind of working against their best interest by not going through with the 12-team playoff. And so we just sort of kind of covered that. Well, I'm not sure that it really is in their best interest to do 12 versus 8 in the long run. Because obviously they're going to be involved in an 8, and the 12, there's just extra benefit for the SEC that may not exist for them. So again, if expansion is going to happen, they're not going to end up with a worse deal than what's been proposed. So the only thing they're out is the money, the extra money they would have made in the next few years. Well, I mean, obviously money is nice and important, but not a big deal. I wouldn't worry about that in the grand scheme of things. What is a worse deal? If a deal is going to be imposed upon them, what is it? Because again, you still have, there are still competing interests with the SEC and the other leagues. So it's not like they're just, I'm not sure what the alternative is that would be worse for those leagues. Maybe they can't get their pet thing with the Rose Bowl, or Kevin Warren can't get P5 guarantees versus just the top 6. But first of all, that's really not a big deal. And second of all, it's almost the same thing. So even if they did lose those things, I don't think it's that big a deal. And I think they're going to have to address the schedule one way or another. So adding multiple years to address changing the schedule, because obviously if a conference like the Big Ten is really considering, in the grand scheme of things, maybe they don't have to have a conference championship game. Well, they would still rather not be the only team to drop their conference championship game. So, and I'm sure all the TV contracts for that are not aligned. Mm-hmm. So that's something else they can all kind of work together on. They can work together and actually change the schedule to where it makes sense to accommodate a 12-team playoff, or they can maybe circle back and end up at 8 teams. And that's also where you talk about player safety and wear and tear on them, and the calendar. Again, I think no one has, and I necessarily didn't even think about this that much, but it always sticks in my mind. The Combine a couple years ago, Joe Burrow, who's a big-time competitor and everything, when they asked him why he wasn't going to throw at the Combine, he said, well, we just finished playing, a few weeks ago. I'm still kind of sore. Well, that's the quarterback who couldn't really go to the Combine and be at his best. And of course, that's not a big deal for Joe Burrow. He was going to be the number 1 pick, but there's any number of guys that would impact who really need to go and be able to work out and be at their best, putting aside guys who would get hurt in the last couple of games, even just guys who need to rest from the season. So moving the championship game farther back is just really not, especially multiple weeks farther back, is just really not feasible to me, in that is another thing that's going to be bad for the players. And I have even thought, and I'm not one of these people who's an alarmist who thinks that all of a sudden you're going to have a trend of juniors opting out the way things are now. Guys who are great sophomores like a Chase Young or a Nick Bosa or Jamar Chase or whoever. I don't think you're going to have that. But I do think if you all of a sudden went from, if you're on a championship contender, you could play 12 or 13 games, or you could play 17 games, That's a big difference. And so I think you could see guys, obviously no one's going to play the season and then opt out in December, but I think you could see it become a little more common for the top 10 or 15 guys to go, who are on real playoff contenders to say, I think that just might be too much for me. And again, when you consider the combine prep time and stuff like that, because that was even what happened with Nick Bosa. Originally when people thought, well, he might be healthy, December 21st or something like that. So, okay, and then that turned out to not necessarily be true. But if it was healthy, that wasn't like in shape to play. And so, like, if he was like, who knows when he would be in shape to play? But by then, it was running up into draft prep too. So it was kind of all these things that worked together. They didn't do themselves any favor just by the way they let that come out. But once they put out all the information, okay, it made sense. He might be healed, but he'd still be a few more weeks before he could play, and that would still run into that being able to be at your best for the NFL draft stuff. So I think that's another issue that could come up and really bite everybody if it got to that point where the schedule was what it was proposed. Now, we talked about the schedule and some pretty obvious changes you could make in a previous one of these, and since then Stuart Mandel laid it out more specifically, and it works pretty well. Even if you have to do the 12-team playoff, you start the season at least a week earlier. And then you've got more room in there to have more of your first couple of rounds in December. You can play your semifinal on January 1st, and then keep the championship game where it is. That's at least a lot more palatable than what they have. So again, you've got time to work out some of these alternatives. I think there's just so many issues with the schedule that got zero discussion when the whole thing got presented that I just don't know. It leads me to believe that it hasn't been treated as a serious problem. Well, now you've got 4 years to treat it as a serious problem.
You've mentioned the Alliance a couple of times, and before I let you go, I wanted to talk about the Alliance real quickly because those three conferences are the three who voted no on this, or they're the ones who prevented this from happening right now. But outside of the college football playoff thing, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot of stuff going on with the Alliance right now. They're not. Gene Smith said they're not doing the scheduling thing anymore, so that's done. So with other, another thing he said that was kind of interesting was he sort of openly acknowledged something that I think everyone else kind of recognized, which is the other leagues need the Big Ten more than the Big Ten needs them. Like the Pac-12 is getting a heck of a lot more out of being associated with the Big Ten than vice versa, and ditto for the ACC and the Big Ten. So is the Alliance purely a playoff voting block at this point? Is there anything else there? I mean, we have all these. There is no contract. There is now not going to be a scheduling thing. Like there is no equity between the standing of these three conferences. Like what is there to the Alliance at this point other than we kind of generally don't want this one thing with the playoff?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of two sides of the same coin. It's one, it is a voting block, which is actionable, and there's action. So they could all. It didn't have to have one conference that was holding this up. It looks better to have three conferences that, even if they all express different objections, that is better for them rather than to be a lot of pressure on one. So that worked, and in the grand scheme of things, it's that they were able to stand together to kind of put the brakes on this. But the other thing is, sometimes it is just good to talk. Like, I cringe whenever I see like a report, this is being discussed or this is being considered. And not that it isn't news, but sometimes stuff gets discussed and nothing happens. But you needed to have the discussion to find out if something should happen or not. And so I always worry about, and this is in numerous things, I always worry about sometimes when things like that get published, if it will impact the outcome, just because I don't want to impact the outcome, like from a journalism standpoint even, and it's a shame, I think, that it has to become public when somebody goes into the portal, because the point of the portal is to let guys and girls explore their options. That doesn't automatically mean they're leaving. And I'd kind of wish that there could be like a moratorium. Maybe they could like just be secretly in the portal for at least a little while so they could really have that, because that's a good thing for them to be able to explore their options and be recruited if they really want to try to find a better situation. I mean, obviously there's other things involved in all that, but in the grand scheme of things, that's a good thing rather than the old system where people had to, clandestinely look around, and obviously it wasn't necessarily certain that everybody who might want you would know you were available and all that. So that's the upshot of that. Well, again, I think so. The alliance, after they had these discussions, they all kind of realized where they stand, and they said, well, this is one thing we agree on. Let's do that. And everything else, if that falls by the wayside, that's fine. I think that's a good thing. And obviously, hopefully with these all being newcomers to their roles, hopefully that helped them develop, a working relationship as well. And hopefully that means that they can work together as we move forward. I didn't think any of the other things that were being proposed were really a good idea, especially for Ohio State. So, this is a good outcome for Ohio State as far as I'm concerned with that, because for all the reasons that Gene Smith explained, Ohio State's schedule doesn't need to be upgraded. So they would actually have to downgrade their schedule basically to be part of it. And why would they do that? And that's on top of basically they'd have to, not only that, they would have to violate contracts probably in the short term to do it. So it was not a good idea for Ohio State, who would have to carry the load when Ohio State has carried the load on all kinds of changes over the last 20 years and hardly gotten any benefit from it as far as I'm concerned, other than, raw money. But I'm not sure that expansion has been good for Ohio State. The first round of the divisions was bad for Ohio State. Having to play more night games and having to play at different times and all that, has that been good for Ohio State? Not really. So, and not everything's been negative, but almost nothing has been positive. It's been way more positive for everybody else in the league. So it was good to see Gene Smith, kind of express that he's going to make sure that, Ohio State is not getting the short end of the stick on some of these things. And if that's at the expense of the alliance changing things for some of the other schools, so be it.
Yeah, there is an awful lot of stuff that's going to be fascinating to watch play out in the next couple of years, because this is obviously sort of an inflection point for the sport, as the Big Ten is going to be going through TV contract negotiations. You're looking at the college football playoff expansion at some point now, and a whole bunch of other stuff, potential conference realignment things. That's all going to be coming. So yeah, it is going to be fascinating to watch this stuff play out over the course of the years. So that I'm sure we'll have plenty more to talk about on coming shows in the coming years. So Marcus, thanks for joining me. Make sure you, if you enjoy college football talk like that, make sure you check out all of our other great podcasts. You can find them all by searching Buckeye Scoop. There's the Buckeye Weekly podcast that Tony Garderman and I do, the Big Me Kickoff podcast with Kevin Noon, the Around the Oval podcast with Alex Gleitman, and Gives in the Bank with Mark Givler and Bill DeBank Green. You can find them all wherever you're listening to this. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. And if you're watching us on YouTube instead, youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop, hit that thumbs up button. That will help other folks find these shows. And then if you hit the bell, that will get you notified every time we post a new video, so you never miss a thing. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.